Chen Yu was arrested and fined the equivalent of £23,000 for selling Christian books in China. Christians like Nasser in the Yemen are arrested and tortured simply for following Jesus. Hoa is a single mum with a 3-year-old daughter who lives in Vietnam, and she was driven out of her village when she professed faith in Jesus. She lost her home and left everything behind. What is the cost of following Jesus? Thomas has just been baptized into the faith. His parents and godparents have just promised that they're going to raise him to follow Jesus. What's the cost? What's the cost for Thomas? Well, in some places in the world, that cost is very obvious, like I've just listed. But that is very far removed from our experience, isn't it? And yet there is still a cost here in the partially tolerant West in which we live. If you're a Christian believer here this morning, let me put the question to you in a slightly different way. Why do we find it so hard to follow Jesus wholeheartedly? Well, because it's costly, even for us. To follow Jesus wholeheartedly costs us our self-centered ways of living. It costs us our worldly ambitions. It can cost us our reputation. It certainly costs us time, energy, and money, or at least it should do. So this morning, let me introduce you to Mary. If you were with us here last week, then you've met her already. She's a friend and a follower of Jesus. She's sister to Lazarus, whom last week we saw Jesus dramatically raise from the dead. We meet Jesus and his disciples at a dinner in this little village near Jerusalem called Bethany. Now, we're not told what time they're having dinner, so we don't know if it's a northern dinner or a southern dinner. But it's a dinner in Jesus' honour, and this is no surprise because Bethany is where Martha, Mary and Lazarus lived and where Lazarus was raised from the dead. What is surprising is what Mary does next. I'm going to read verse 3 to just remind you of what she did. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Mary takes out a very expensive jar of perfume. She breaks the neck of it and begins pouring the perfume out on Jesus. Now in John's account, John focuses on Jesus' feet. Now think about it, in those days everyone went around in sandals, they're dusty, they're mucky, they're filthy. She takes really expensive perfume and pours it on Jesus' feet. And as everyone there is looking on, they're kind of shocked, their mouths are open. She does something even more crazy. She lets down her hair, which, respectable women didn't do, and then she starts wiping his feet with her hair, which, no one ever does. And so while this beautiful and exotic fragrance is filling the house, Judas, one of the 12 apostles, kicks up a stink. And now Judas' objection, it's equally understandable, but also tragic. What a waste! That money could have raised £30,000 on eBay. That money could have gone to charity. There are starving children that could have been clothed and fed with that money. You stupid woman, what are you doing? Well, what do you think? I mean, he's right, isn't he? Imagine you had some special guest round for tea. Imagine you owned a bottle of, perfume worth £30,000, I want to come round to your house if you do. But, imagine, even if you had the king round for tea, would you pour that out over his head, over his feet? Well, it'd be a crazy waste. But actually, as much as it's understandable, Judas is tragically wrong. He's missed who Jesus is and what he's come to do. This is a huge tragedy. Judas is one of the 12 apostles. He's an insider. He's seen Jesus' miracles. He's heard Jesus' teaching. He's even gone out on mission and shared the good news of the kingdom, and we expect probably done miracles in Jesus' name. But John tells us that after the event, they all found out that actually he was a thief, helping himself to what was in the shared money bag. But this wasn't Judas's biggest problem. His biggest problem is that his heart was closed to Jesus. He got as close to Jesus as you can get, and yet he wasn't captivated in awesome wonder at the Son of God in the flesh. Judas's heart was cold, just like the money that he coveted and stole. And so Judas, an apostle, pours abuse on someone who really does see Jesus' true value and worth. Mary's devotion to Jesus makes no sense at all unless you understand how valuable Jesus is. Do you? Most people around us in society today don't. Even going to church today can be viewed as a bit of an odd hobby, can't it? And then actually maybe, reading the Bible or going to a midweek group or a prayer meeting or helping with church activities or giving your money to support the work of the church. Why on earth would you do that? Christian views today are misunderstood, misrepresented, and sometimes ridiculed and even shamed. This is part of the cost of following Jesus. But let me ask you this. Do you think Mary cares? She gets rebuked by an apostle. That must hurt. And there are plenty of other tuts and grumbles around the table. But I don't think Mary cares one bit. She is so overwhelmed with joy and love and thanks to Jesus. What Mary's doing is not duty or obligation. It's free and glad devotion to the one to whom she owes everything. Mary's only too happy to pour out her reputation, to pour out her possessions at Jesus' feet because she knows Jesus is worth it. I know what it is to fear the opinion of others. I know what it is to be held back by the fear of missing out. Do you recognize some of those same shackles? Do you want to be free of them? Well, Mary is our example. Her heart is so full of Jesus, she doesn't care. She can live wholeheartedly for him. She understands that he is the resurrection and the life, her life. So she's prepared to shatter social convention and pour out £30,000 of perfume on Jesus. And I love then how Jesus goes on to defend Mary. While everyone else is scowling and tutting, Jesus looks at them and rebukes them. Leave her alone. Just as we saw last week, the high priest Caiaphas spoke more truly than he knew, Mary has acted more truly than she knew. Jesus' death is just days away, and without knowing it, Mary has prepared Jesus' body for burial. If you follow Jesus and you live wholeheartedly for him, what you do has a value to Jesus that you can't even imagine. See about how Jesus looks upon Mary's devotion. That's how he looks upon our acts of love and obedience. And it's not just Mary, we get others' devotion in this passage too. There's Lazarus. The authorities want him dead, but he's spreading the news about what Jesus has done for him. There's the crowd who saw Lazarus raised from the dead. They go out spreading the news too, in spite of the dangerous atmosphere. The Jewish authorities had already decided they're going to excommunicate, they're going to kick out anyone who tries to say Jesus is the Messiah. But they go and spread the news anyway. Jesus has come down. He's the one. He's come to rescue and save, and you've got to know about him, no matter what the authorities say. Well, where do you see yourself in this story? Would you say that you're like Mary or Lazarus? You're devoted to Jesus because you know just what he's done for you. Are you like some of those in the crowd who are spreading the news? You've seen enough to believe and follow, and you know that Jesus needs to be passed on. Or maybe you're like others there at the time. Maybe, you're kind of interested. You'd like to see what's all this fuss about Jesus that these people are talking about. Or maybe you're like the authorities. And really, you could do without all this talk of Jesus. Where do you see yourself? So John lays before us the cost of following Jesus. But he also tells us why it's worth following. John shows us how believing and following in Jesus means we have restored relationship with God. A restored relationship that we were always made for. But even as Jesus makes us wonderful promises, we can be suspicious. We can think, what's it really going to be like if I put my life into Jesus' hands? Is it safe? Is it worth it? What's Jesus going to do? Well, for that, we need to then look to how he rides humbly into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Trying not to confuse you, obviously it's the run up to Christmas at the minute, but the events here in John 12 are the events of Palm Sunday that happened before the first Easter. There were hundreds and thousands of pilgrims in Jerusalem. There was real kind of nationalistic fervour in Jerusalem at this time. Imagine a kind of crowd as they've just watched their team win a kind of a World Cup game, that kind of crowd kind of behaviour, and they see Jesus coming. And they cut down palm branches, and they're waving these palm branches because that's the symbol of free Israel. Israel was under occupation from the Romans, and they're waving the palm branches as a symbol of free Israel. And they're shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. There's something really good about what this crowd do. They see something of who Jesus is, and they're saying, look, he's the true King, he's the Messiah. You know, they're shouting his praises. But Jesus is not the King they were expecting. Some have seen his signs, others have heard his teaching. But what the crowd are expecting is, or what they want, is an uprising. A rebellion against Rome to throw off Rome's shackles and have a free Jewish state with the King of Israel, the Messiah, at their heads. They'd be right to expect that if Jesus was riding in on a war horse. But no, Jesus deliberately subverts that. Jesus finds a young donkey and he humbly rides into Jerusalem, fulfilling a 500-year-old prophecy. We had a little bit of it read earlier from Zechariah. John quotes it in verse 15 when he says, Fear not, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. It's a prophecy about the true king who at the same time will hold all power and yet be totally humble. He'll be the righteous one. He'll be the one who will save and will make peace by subduing the nations. And yet he'll humbly ride in on a donkey. That's how you'll spot him. You'll see him riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. So here's Jesus. God in the flesh. All the power of God at his disposal, but he's using it to serve. He's the king who stoops to use his power to serve us. And then John just gives us another little tiny indicator of the truthfulness of his account. This is what John says in verse 16. He's counting himself in this. His disciples did not understand these things at first. But when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things had been written about him and been done to him. John says, look, we didn't get it at the time. We didn't understand what was going on. But afterwards, then we finally joined the dots. When you look closely at Jesus, when you come to read one of the biographies of his life that are found in the New Testament, you get to see the most confident, most powerful person ever to walk on earth, and yet at the same time the most humble, the most gentle. Jesus is so attractive. If you come to Jesus, you have nothing to fear. He has all power, and yet he wields it in service of others. As he walks on earth, he does nothing except in humble dependence on his Father God. He deserves all glory and loyalty, and yet he walks to a lonely and shameful death for us. Jesus is the only one that we can trust our lives to and not fear. If you come to Jesus, he's not going to take advantage of you. No, he's going to give you everything. He's not going to let you down because all things are already in his hands. Nothing is outside his control. And it also means that we can't screw it up because he has done it all. He's the one who rides into Jerusalem. He's the one who died on the cross in our place so that we might be brought into his family, that we might know his Father through him, that we might be forgiven and restored and redeemed and rescued, that we might know life and life to the full. All we need to do is accept his gift, to believe and follow him. It costs to follow Jesus. We live in a society that derides him and his followers. He calls us to put our lives into his hands and to let him call the shots. For us to take the little crown off our heads and to lay it at his feet like Mary. But whatever the cost, it is worth it. Just ask those Christians who are willing to be arrested and beaten up and tortured for their faith. When we truly see who Jesus is and what he's done for us, then we will gladly and joyfully follow him, whatever the cost, wherever he leads. So what's your response this morning? Let me urge you to not let the commercial hype and the busy stress of December to overtake you. If you're a Christian here this morning, this Christmas time, fill your vision with Jesus. Live for him wholeheartedly. Live flat out for him because he is your life and he's worth it. And if you're not a Christian believer here this morning, do you find yourself drawn to Jesus? Is your interest kind of piqued by him? Well, here are a few things you could do. Keep coming back here to All Hallows. We love sharing the message of Jesus every Sunday. If you've got a Bible at home, pick one up at home, or you can find the Bible free to read on the internet. Look at one of those first accounts of Jesus' life. Or talk to a Christian that you know. Ask them your questions and find out about him. Finding Jesus is worth everything. I'm going to say a prayer for us. Would you bow your heads? Father in heaven, thank you for what we see of Mary's beautiful devotion to Jesus. Please inspire us to follow after Jesus and to lay everything at his feet. Thank you that he is the humble King with all power who serves us. Thank you that he came at Christmas as a baby so that he might die at Easter. Thank you that he did all these things for us. Please soften our hearts, warm them to your Son, that they might be filled with love and devotion to him. And we ask this for his name's sake. Amen.